I will not be speaking about myself so much, but I will be speaking about some issues that I've been thinking about, particularly related to the logic of exclusion that's inherent to art institutions, and to try to kind of think about some strategies of negotiating such problems that don't just rely on simple questions of like alternative spaces or large or canonical spaces or inside or outside and all of this stuff. So much of my talk is going to be referring to a text that I wrote in 2011 with Chris Fitzpatrick for this Canadian journal called Philip, and it was called A Productive Irritant, Parasitical Inhabitations in Contemporary Art. And initially we were inspired by this French philosopher Michel Serres' book called The Parasite, which defines the parasite through kind of three different ways of thinking about the parasite. The biological parasite, one of which is this. This is a Zygmothura exigua, which is a tongue-eating louse that attaches itself to a fish's tongue, and eventually it pulls so much blood that it atrophies the fish's tongue, and it then is so attached to the body of the fish that the fish actually lives the rest of its life with this parasite as its tongue. So we were thinking about like how different artists can kind of like enter into spaces and generate become the kind of voice or the tongue of the institution. We're also thinking about social parasites and also communicative parasites, because also Michel Serres points out that the parasite in French is also a word for noise, like the noise in a signal. So one thing that's important about this text was that it kind of looked at the parasite as a vehicle for introducing irritants into any given order, causing subtle changes that can be productive and cumulative. And in our text, we were really looking at how certain artists have used kind of parasitical operations as effective strategies for manipulating context, the introduction of kind of unsuspected tactics into spaces and redistributing the energy and the kind of surplus that these institutions kind of depend on, and the identification of kind of weaknesses within kind of seemingly enclosed or taught kind of systems. The figure of the parasite extends to artists as a means of kind of surveying, articulating, questioning, and contaminating relations, a tool to determine loopholes, interdependencies, differences, and positions within closed systems. So, I'm trying to kind of propose the parasite, especially in the context of this festival, as a kind of useful figure to kind of speak about how we kind of negotiate these kind of various overlapping systems of exploitation and unequal exchanges that form the many art worlds that are operating today. And this dependency on these kind of spaces is also quite productive. As Andrea Fraser once said, the dependence is a condition of our autonomy. And so it's like, how do we shift and disrupt kind of these naturalized logics of dependencies and exploitation, and to enable kind of survival for ourselves. And it's not just as a rhetorical exercise, it's also a kind of form of self-reflection. I'm returning to this text after many years as a way to kind of also think of my own kind of place in the world, and also of these different types of institutions. As Łukasz mentioned, I was working at the Kunstverein München, which is a Kunstverein, one of the oldest Kunstvereins, and a very established kind of institution with its own kind of very established history, and it was very much supported by individual members in the city, but it also it was historically instrumental in the kind of production of the bourgeoisie, of the kind of middle class, of the idea of public space and art as a kind of form for public space. And so I really believed in these kind of concepts, but at the same time, as I was there, I also realized that even though I had a very international program and was also responding to very local concerns, that such institutions were kind of playing different roles for many different people. And many times I kept thinking of Groucho Marx. The comedian had this statement that he said, "I don't want to belong to any club that would accept me as one of its members." And that's kind of how I felt in such a space. So now that I've left there, I'm kind of trying to rethink these institutions and all these kind of problems. I mean, whether or not you're a student or you're operating in the art field for many years, it's hard not to be ambivalent about this entire kind of endeavor. We all know that art is complicit in material and these ideological systems of exploitation, abuse, power, and violence. And even the supposed winners in the system feel exploited. Yet there's nobody to accept responsibility. So I feel like this kind of ambivalence is actually something that's shared, is something that all of us as cultural workers and all engaged in this kind of field, that we all are kind of all sitting there wondering whether or not we should be learning computer science, or like, you know, I was a gardener for my first 15 years of being a curator. I was doing exhibitions all over the world, but I was also digging holes all day. And so I think that kind of ambivalence around being in or out is something that's not just an anxiety for students as they're coming into the field, but also for all of us. And I think that this is very much a product of this kind of increasing professionalization, and which also builds all these types of expectations and certain kind of rules of homogenizing kind of tendencies about career making in the schools or residencies, institutions, grants, prizes, that makes it seem like it's a meritocracy, but it's really not. And I think one of the biggest kind of issues today is, particularly say for Polish artists, I think one of the things that we should all be considering is not reaffirming or validating the centers. You know, a place like Berlin is also very important because of people who are escaping other spaces, and that it becomes many different things. But the overemphasis on, like, you know, as artists develop, that they need to go to Paris or London or Berlin or New York as kind of markers of their development, I think is highly problematic. And that kind of centralization becomes really a kind of limitation for how all of us can live. Particularly like Poland is a good example of a place that often kind of international exchanges are done geopolitically, or they're done as kind of through the kind of mediators of the kind of specific centers and specific kind of governments and ambitions. And for instance, I've been working in and out of the Baltics for the last 12 years or something, and you know, they are very much not so aware of what's happening in Poland, just as people in Poland are not so aware of these. And these are opportunities and ways of building new relationships and forming a new kind of world that is not based off of this bizarre template that Pablo Higuera was proposing for all of us. So how do we participate in such this system while contesting its kind of corrupt logics? And one of the reasons why I'm bringing up the parasite is what's interesting about this kind of figure is to think about how to negotiate your surroundings and how and different ways that your presence can bring about certain responses, how it can kind of antagonize the foundation of certain systems to become productive for change, and that you can kind of infiltrate routines that can become much more, makes it a little bit more open for yourselves to also be exploited, or to understand the kind of systems of exploitation and exchange that are going on, and to begin to contest these kind of things. So like looking historically, like in this text, we talked about how in 1969, the artist Harvey Stromberg, he posed as an eager student and went to the MoMA in New York all the time. And while he was there, he was actually secretly measuring and taking photographs of all the kind of stuff in the exhibition spaces, the keyholes, the bricks, the air vents, and so on. And then he printed these photos, and then he would sneak in there and print them at 1-to-1 scale, and would place them all over the institution. They were often found and destroyed by museum employees, but he was never caught doing this. And after a few years, he kind of decided to kind of come out and say that he's been doing this surreptitious artwork in order to kind of make people aware that there are conflicts between museums and artists, and namely about not just who's allowed to exhibit and who is not, but also what's been sanctioned by the institution or not, but but also to draw attention to all these kind of peripheral information that's surrounding exhibitions that are not necessarily the art itself. You know, a more political kind of version of this would be the Puerto Rican artist Rafael Freire. Also, in 1968, he, without being invited, he became the 10th artist in this very notable exhibition called 9 at Leo Castelli. Leo Castelli was this very famous gallerist at the time. And this was an exhibition that was curated by Robert Morris, and it was kind of a thesis on anti-form kind of art. And Rafael Ferrer, even though he knew Robert Morris and was part of this community very much, he wasn't invited to participate. So what he did was that he and some students and collaborators of his grabbed 87 large trash bags full of dried leaves, and they snuck into Leo Castelli Gallery and would dump them into these mounds on the ground. So first they stopped at this Cy Twombly exhibition, and then they went on to the kind of big warehouse that Leo Castelli was presenting this. And by inserting his own work into these spaces, he kind of tapped not only the context of the exhibition itself and his exclusion from it, but he also took advantage of the kind of spotlight that these exhibitions afford, simultaneously bringing more attention to his practice. There's an artist in Vilnius today whose name escapes me, and I was trying to remember it.
I know them.
Yeah.
Stasis.
Yes, exactly. Stasis. And his entire, I mean, he has done other artworks, but generally his entire practice is about coming and attending different exhibitions in Vilnius. And he would always bring in his own kind of artworks or appear in costume as a way of, and it was always kind of clever that he was kind of interpreting the theme. He would like read the press release, and then he would make a kind of artwork as a kind of response to it. I have to say, like, multiple times I've done exhibitions in Vilnius that he did that in, and I was very happy to see it, but I was kind of disappointed about his contribution. But but I think it was nice that he was kind of taking advantage of the visibility of these exhibitions, and again, showing that in order for these exhibitions to exist, they have to be both private and open to the public. And so by just coming in the front door, we have this kind of other kind of worldly access into spaces that I think is really important. So the parasite is kind of a strategy of convenience, this kind of operational channel for riding the waves of already established communication to kind of exploit the scale and the power of these institutions. But one of the kind of problems of these type of things is that they also reaffirm the kind of power of these institutions by choosing the MoMA as a place to like present your work or sneaking into the gallery. We're also reifying their kind of power. We're asserting that is a kind of marker for ourselves that we depend on as some sort of validation. At the same time, I think it's very important, and this is one thing that Stas has made the mistake of a couple of times, is that you should always kind of, when you're critiquing, you should always punch up. This is like how comedians talk about it. You don't just like go and fuck with some apartment gallery just because you want to like antagonize it. It's important to understand about how these kind of power structures are working and what it means to be critiquing people within spaces. So over the last few decades, there's been this increasing willingness of institutions to invite artists into their spaces to critique their collections or intervene in the kind of daily workings of the space. And some would argue that this kind of parasite to host relationship should always be contentious, that it should always be a kind of attack, and that any sort of an invitation or allowance on the part of the institution to give the intruding force power would kind of negate the kind of parasitical quality. I mean, a good example is that is that at one point there was a kind of health craze where people would ingest roundworms to lose weight. So this kind of like you're bringing in this kind of parasite for a positive thing, but at the same time it is also it doesn't negate its harmful potential. As Sarah's remind us, the guest can disgrace and abuse the charity of the host, and exposed the host itself as a kind of parasite that's dependent on the artists, workers, and public to exist. A couple years ago, in 2016, the Chisenhale Gallery in London held an exhibition by Maria Eichhorn titled 5 Weeks, 25 Days, 175 Hours, where the artist counterintuitively closed the gallery for the entire duration of the exhibition. This is like a very old school gesture, right? This is like classic kind of interrogating the white cube kind of action. But more than just that, it was very important that she was validating the labor and time that was involved with this kind of line between the work and professional life, and work and personal life. So the doors were locked, and all the staff members were actually they were given a vacation, and they all received pay. So she took the exhibition and she used that as a way to kind of maintain the lifestyles of everybody else. And in fact, when the workers returned back to the exhibition space, nobody had to make up any work. In fact, every email that was sent during that period of time of almost 6 weeks was immediately deleted. So that was an interesting idea, that you also did rather than taking slow time, that we were just like, she created a kind of marker that just stopped everything. And by doing that, she kind of came in through the front door and then kind of chased everyone out of the house. She kind of inverted this relationship between this invitation and forced the institution to readjust. Another example of this would be in 2008, the Mexican duo Quito. They analyzed and redistributed the resources of a very important artist-run center called New Lincoln Arts when they were invited into the institution. So what they literally did was to box up Langton's entire archive, place the boxes on seahorses in the gallery, and title their exhibition "New Lincoln Arts Archive for Sale: A Sacrificial Act." And it was up for auction, although there was no buyer, funny enough. And one of the important things, I worked in this institution at the time. Langton was one of the first artist-run institutions in the United States, and this was it was a fundamental place for early performance art and early video art, and mail art and all types of different kind of practices that had come out of this place. But nobody knew at the time, but they were extremely struggling and they were about to go out of business. But the artists, they figured this out, and they wanted to kind of do a gesture of kind of summing up, giving a kind of frank public evaluation of the meaning of success, legacy, and service of the institution. So they just had a very simple proposal: sell the only tangible asset that the organization had, its history or its memory, and use that money to underwrite a year or so of continued existence. It created this kind of debate where people were, on one end, people were saying that this place had been around for 30, 40 years and that it no longer was important and that we should let it die. Other people were saying that this archive needed to be maintained, needed to be cloned, and that it would be used as a kind of, it could be very valuable for stimulating future action. But in the end, both camps kind of saw their arguments partially fulfilled after the doors closed in the summer of 2009. So within a year and a half, this place was gone. And this archive was actually then in huge kind of contestation. I was one of the people who came to reorganize it so that it could be then taken out of this place, because they were literally planning on just throwing everything away. And I'm not much of a fetishist for the archive, but this was quite important kind of place. So here they took the institution hostage to Quito, violently kind of establishing their own law by arresting a space and quite generously forcing it to readjust and reappraise itself. And this kind of reminds me of a considerably more ethically complex project called El Préstamo, The Loan, by the Guatemalan artist Anibal Lopez. In 2000, Lopez, who's a very important Guatemalan artist today, he robbed an unsuspecting passerby in Guatemala City at gunpoint and used the pillaged money to fund his exhibition. So, faced with the fact that he had no budget for his exhibition, he went out into public space and robbed somebody with a gun. And so there, the victim became this kind of unwilling was unwillingly turned into a patron, funding the exhibition, the installation, the invitation, the costs, and all the other stuff associated with the opening reception. In fact, this kind of poster that he presented also was kind of also reminding everybody that as viewers there, they were also they were also complicit in what had transpired and the motivations around this. They were enjoying was courtesy of this crime. So with El Pistamo, an unequal relation between each party was involved in the work. The artist, the victim, the witness, the audience, and Lopez kind of traversed the chain of asymmetrical exchanges and introduced a kind of switch in regards to the funding of the artist, taking a system which the artist seems to be vulnerable to the whims of foundations, collectors, and governments, and making society itself vulnerable to the artist. The idea of the artist as this kind of volatile criminal who could potentially snap, and that actually our institutions need to be there just to keep us from spilling out into the rest of the world and doing our kind of evil, dastardly deeds. But there's when an artist is invited into the home of an art institution, the kind of unspoken pact is that the artist must be thankful and exchange the benefits of financing and resources for this kind of symbolic capital of their works and their presence. And I think that that's very interesting because you think of like when you sneak into like a gallery dinner or there's like a buffet there and people are like they're too proud to like eat up the buffet or drink all the wine, and it's like do drink the wine and do eat up the buffet, because what's happening there is not simply some sort of act of charity or act of bringing you into their kind of world. It's also a form of parasitic exchange, where essentially once you're at the host table, the parasite has to kind of regale the other diners with their kind of stories and their mirth and their weirdness. And to be exact, the parasite exchanges good talk for good food. She buys her dinner by paying it with words. So I'm always one to gobble up this big dinner, and I feel that it is our right to do so, but we should always be aware of what type of kind of exchanges are happening in our work and look for ways to kind of redirect those resources so that we can survive. Even on a smaller level, I'm reminded of an artist friend who was contacted by a museum that he had done a show with a few years before, and they had planned on doing a book, but they never actually made the book. And they told him he needed to propose a project using those funds or it would be lost, like it would just disappear somehow. And that same week, he found out that his partner was pregnant and that they needed to get a car to handle the kid in their busy schedules. So he'd already been kind of thinking about a project that was about the ill-fated production of the Renault Avant team, which only existed for a year. And it was a kind of weird hybrid of a coupe minivan, kind of, if you could imagine. And it was very much about like, cool guys growing up somehow. And lo and behold, a used model of the car was available at exactly the same price that the museum had offered him. So he proposed it to him, he bought the car, he made a movie and an installation out of it, and his family now drives the car around. So here you have not only this overlapping of personal professional life, but also a way of redistributing resources and taking advantage of the system, which is hardly antagonistic. It's just a clever way to deal with a system whereby our lives are not valued, but only our work. So, I mean, this is one thing to kind of consider in any sort of kind of invitation, is like, how can you make it work for you? In what ways can these things be used in more than one way to support our lives as much as just our work? So artists are becoming less and less keen to separate their labor, creativity, exhibition venues, and the sponsors that support them, and everybody's getting sick of also particularly in the U.S. of being of all these sponsors that fund art that are kind of whitewashing their crimes. So you could think of like somebody like Nan Goldin, who used her kind of fame and prestige as a way to kind of to call out the Sackler family, which are kind of one of the main guilty parties in the kind of opioid crisis around the world. And so by calling them out, all these different institutions had to kind of separate from them, divest from these kind of institutions. I mean, you also think of like the Tate or the Serpentine or the Whitney, who've also recently had a bunch of very effective protests in terms of calling out corporate funders like BP at the Tate for destroying the fucking world, and or the Whitney for having a board member who makes bullets, and particularly also like tear gas, not tear gas, but like rubber bullets that are shot at protesters all over the world, or gas canisters that are used in all types of protests and in war. Think of like the Gulf Labor Coalition that was also protesting at the Guggenheim, calling out the condition of the laborers. Or like in 2014 Sydney Biennial, for instance, 41 artists, which was a little bit more than half of the artists in the biennial, refused to participate unless they divested from this company that was the main underwriters for these detention centers for immigrants, and that was hugely what at the time was being very much known for its human rights abuses, and actually they still are. So many ways, like some of these types of actions within our institutions are kind of working. I mean, there's also like like these types of organizations like Wage, or in Germany and in Poland there was these art associations who fought for living wages, or at least some level of regulation around like support for artists. So one of the things that we have power on in this kind of overwhelming system is to be able to make these kind of claims. But at the same time, surely it's a lot easier for non-Golden or Hito Style to call these things out from this position of power. But we should all understand that we have a kind of responsibility and possibility to do so. Often a lot of institutions are kind of recognizing this need to mobilize progressive content, but often they're ultimately resistant to being modified by this content. And so you have a lot of kind of like institutions that are really into discourse, or alter institutions. I mean, this was Katerina Dego, she wrote about Ahmet Ogud, or Tanya Beguera, and Jonas Stahl, and these type of kind of para-institutions that have also developed out of artist practices and using, and we're using the kind of resources to be of these institutions to be able to do other kind of discursive and social practice kind of actions. But the problem with some of these practices, not only do they depend on the artists and their energy and benevolence to continue, but they're often gobbled up by the institutions as some sort of credibility of their political or social ideology without actually changing the actual workings of the institution. A really good example of this is how often many of these museums will do exhibitions using kind of feminist topics, but in their day-to-day, they're continuously exploiting, devaluing the labor of the women working there. So it's like these institutions have to actually incorporate these type of understandings in a much more, to look in the mirror as they're doing this. I mean, one could say that the entire history of art in the last 50 years has been about these types of escape attempts, and early alternative artist-run centers had similar motivations, not just to create spaces because the larger venues were not doing it, but to also articulate very specific political or social or aesthetic kind of dictums, and to test these out. But one of the things that's really disappointing about a lot of alternative spaces, or even like, when we're creating our own institutions, I'm always really surprised. I'm not just talking about like an apartment gallery who paints all the walls white and decides that it's a space. That's nice and can be important, but often when we're creating our institutions, we often try to mimic the very institutions that we're contesting. I've ran into this a lot, having done a lot of writing, where people would start like magazines and stuff, and then they would like give very kind of rigid kind of editorial kind of terms to it, when it's like, look, like you're building your own house. It could be anything, you know. It doesn't have to follow the same kind of rules that we've been brought into. And so, like as an example of that even work? Yeah, okay. As an example of like one such kind of endeavor that I think is really kind of questioning some of these type of relationships is the Karabic residency, and alternatively the life sport is what it's called. And it's started by an artist and a curator couple, and they've been contesting the very terms in which venues exist. Instead of forcing the artist to come to them for a residency, the Karabic residency, they would often travel to the artist, or even better, they would meet the artist at like once they met up with an artist at Euro Disney, and then they walked back to Paris, for instance. And so that's the residency, is to like meet them there. A couple of years ago, they also decided to take the little funding that they had and the time and the contacts and the support, and give it to a single artist. So over the course of a year, they would be essentially like they would build a kind of company and support structure surrounding an artist to enable them to do things. Now they've been based in Athens for the last few years, and they operate an event venue that is supported, and all of their activities are supported by the local production and sale of these sweatpants. So thereby they're mimicking this operations of a store to support their endeavors, but they're redistributing this kind of information. They're creating a kind of parallel infrastructure, reappraisal of all these kind of expectations that we have about what an exhibition space should be, or what a residency should be. And residencies in particular, I mean, I think all artists should be doing residencies all the time, but at the same time, the kind of international kind of network of that globe, for instance, and this residency structure has really depended on the cheap and ecologically corrupt air travel and all types of like dirty dealings between different government groups. And so it's hugely significant to kind of begin to kind of question these. And a number of institutions like HIAP in Helsinki, for instance, right now is also reconsidering how can they do residencies so that not only it's more supportive for artists, but also more ecologically thoughtful. So with all this kind of shit going on, I mean, even when institutions have attempted to do things differently, they often have this kind of fundamental contradiction and exploitation at their heart. And attempts to bring in the kind of formerly excluded, those from outside the West or the global North, women, or a broader range of gender or sexual identities, it always seems to come with this kind of problematic condition and an expectation for people to kind of perform their identity or their place. So first the field gets defined by a group of people in this exclusive setting, then the formerly excluded are invited to pass, but only if they can kind of exhibit more bravado and work harder than the ones who are trained within the system, playing the system better than everyone else. And so, one argument would be just to leave. And this artist and theorist, Fulvia Carnevale, who is part of this collective, Claire Fontaine, she wrote a text many years ago called The Feminist Leaves. And she's talking about how Italian feminists in the 70s left everything. They left art, they left the Communist Party, they left the parliament, they left the psychiatric society, and they left their family. And they left to start again with a kind of new redefinition, to kind of think a redefinition of many different fields, of like psychoanalysis without penis envy, with politics without a patriarchal system of leadership, and field of creation without this kind of system of exclusion. I mean, there's an entire kind of, this is Graciela Carnevale, different Carnevale, but this is an Argentinian artist in the 60s who also, she locked the gallery at the opening. And so then it took about an hour for everybody to realize that they were locked in, and a bystander outside saw that people were trapped and shattered the window so that people can get out. So there's all these kind of escape attempts, and art history is like full of all these dropouts, most of which we've never heard of, but there are many others whose practice have led them out of the art world into something else. such as numerous artists who have started community projects or bands, for instance. I mean, I'm really excited to hear that, because I think like the history of music from art school dropouts is quite profound. And you know, then you have like people like Hans de Vries, who became a farmer, Ben Kinmont, who became a book dealer, Lloyd Parson, Lloyd Parson was an artist in the 90s, yeah, who became so disoriented when a collector purchased her entire exhibition that she was just like, fuck it, and left. You know, another example would be Lee Lozano, who famously went from doing a general strike in the New York art world to implementing a work that she was avoiding all contact with women, which is an interesting provocation, to a final kind of dropout piece. Charlotte Pozinets, yeah. Okay. Very, very quick. Okay, so yeah, and I mean, but these people get co-opted immediately. You know, one of the problems with leaving is as Helmut Draxler has argued, is that the desire to leave is part of the same systemic thinking as which has the illusion embedded that we can leave, which actually makes us only reinforce it. There's this artist Randall Zott, who for many years has been calling attention to the problem that we refer to what we do as work, that we're making work, we're making artworks, and that this is an incorporation of a capitalist economy and a relationship to labor that is already problematic. So he calls for art to be brought back to leisure, which I think is an interesting idea, but at the same time it bothers me as a laborer and somebody who has also had to fight to maintain that integrity. But if some artists can unlink themselves from these economies, but you know, it's mostly because they can afford to and they have some sort of other privilege that allows them to. Recently, Hirostaro, she recently called for art workers to explore what else could be what we could do with all of our kind of tools, and was thinking about like how we could redistribute these relationships, and it reminded me of the artist placement group, who were these guys these people in the 60s in the UK, who sought to position artists within corporations and factories in order to mutually influence these different worlds. This is artists on a boat, I guess. Another example was the Anything Company in Canada. I wrote my master's thesis on them. They were kind of a hybrid of it was a family and artist group and a corporation, and they're kind of they didn't even want to talk about art. They wanted to talk about visual sensitivity information, and wanted to kind of reframe everything as a kind of McLuhan-esque kind of endeavor to going into the world, and they would go to trade fairs as well. At the same time, I'd also like to think of people like Vincent Trasov, who ran for mayor of Vancouver as Mr. Peanut in 1974, 1976, as a purely aesthetic platform. Also, this artist Christina Lucas, she did a piece where she changed her name. She applied for a name change from Kristen Sue Lucas to Kristen Sue Lucas. And she had said that it was like when you push refresh on your browser, like she wanted to update herself like a web page. But what it did was it forced the kind of judge and the kind of entire legal system to kind of begin to think philosophically about their kind of power and control. I mean, there's a number of other artists who of course like go out into the world. Kristen Yankovsky is a good example. One of my favorites was that he enlisted the Vatican in a reality TV kind of contest where they picked their favorite Jesus. It was called Jesus, Casting Jesus, and so that's the Jesus. And it turns out that this Jesus, he's actually kind of a Buddhist, which is even more beautiful that way. But then for an exhibition that I'm half a minute, and then yeah. So then Jesus was then appearing all over the place, and we were doing an exhibition in Mexico, and he brought him onto telenovelas, and he also had him do these public spaces, which was actually quite sad because you had like these grandmas just going nuts and crying and everything. Another example would be Johnny Modi, this Swiss artist who for a week in this Swiss newspapers, he followed around these cameramen working at the newspaper and just like appeared in the background. There he is back there. There he is there. And so like over the course of like a week, you were just like seeing this guy appear all over the place. And probably his most amazing kind of piece was in 1997. He attended the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, and he noticed that there was a vacant seat in the Indonesia's delegate. And so when he saw that it was empty, he snuck in there and he started voting and replaced the absent representative. And so when the time came to vote, and if anybody wanted to give a speech, Modi rose up and he made this speech on ethnic division, aesthetics, and human rights. And the representatives of the indigenous Americans and other marginalized ethnic groups all rallied to the words of the Indonesian delegate and walked out of the assembly in solidarity with Modi's position. So the reason why I bring this up is that the parasite is a kind of means of kind of looking at kind of spaces that are unattended in normal business and to exploit these pathways, to exploit the publicness, the controlledness, the different kind of pathways of relationships and expectations, and to use these kind of pathways as a way to kind of sneak in like a parasite to articulate different desires and different needs and to kind of claim our own kind of space within there. Just to leave on a half a quote from Mr. Serre, the parasite doesn't stop. It doesn't stop eating or drinking or yelling or burping or making thousands of noises or filling space with its swarming and din. The parasite is an expansion. It runs and grows. It invades and occupies. Thank you.
We have 3 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Takie super z tą kamerą jeszcze z Rickiem, taki wiesz, level up.
While some artists are protesting the dependency of art institutions on oil, other artists are buying cars as their art projects, which actually shows that the art world is a kind of polymorphous whatever and can provide an example for anything, right? When Apple introduced iPhone, they had this advertising campaign. There's an app for that. Whatever you want to do, there's an app for that. So it could be there's an art for that. Whatever you want to show or do. However, this is only. I have more sort of comments or reflections after your lecture. Probably more interesting thing. I think the Parasite, it's a great, both the book by Michel Serres and the concept. I really liked what Matteo Pasquinelli did with it in Animal Spirits, where he showed how capitalism is a kind of parasite that can actually feed and grow or anything, and even something that is apparently contradictory to its logic. However, there is another metaphor or model from the ecosystem that probably fits better what you were showing. Is the one of decomposers or reducers. Right, in every ecosystem you have 3 positions: producers who produce, consumers who consume, and then you have those who work with the remains, with what is left after consumption, right? So these are reducers mushrooms or the bacteria that literally eat shit, right? If you do not have proper installation in your home to get rid of your shit, you just have a tank. I don't know what's the English word for that. You have a tank where the shit accumulates. You can buy this septic tank. You can buy these pills that you throw into the toilet, and these pills are bacteria that would eat the shit within the septic tank. So I think this is because I think the concept of the parasite implies that there is something dangerous or harmful for the system in this artistic activity. Well, as a matter of fact, my conclusion from a lecture is that rather it's, well, the cartoon you showed with the neoliberal, my art was the most anti-neoliberal, that it turned out that it depended on neoliberalism. I think it's much more this kind of integration relation, because parasite is something that harms, is harmful. Well, actually all these activities are rather, that's what I understood from your lecture. They are not harmful, they are integrated within the system.
They force the system to readjust. I mean, that's also, I mean, this is also something that Michel Serre talks about also, is that it's like, that they're not even like an antagonist, but it's more like almost like a kind of apolitical agonism somehow of kind of coming in and kind of stirring up things. Particularly the way that institutions also like depend on this type of stuff. It's like, it's I mean, again, like the last 50 years of art practice can be very much organized from people like calling things out and then that getting incorporated into the institutions themselves. So it's like the like you're saying, like it makes much more sense to think about decomposers. At the same time, what I think is important about the parasite is that what the parasite also does, it's not just a matter of like some sort of enmical relationship between like the host and the parasite, but actually that the parasite kind of occupies a domain and forces the body to then kind of incorporate it into itself, like the fish with the tongue, you know, it they become kind of mutualistic. They're existing simultaneous with each other. And what I think is important, particularly when we think about like social parasites, and you know that's always like that they're just like sneaking in for they just only came here for the opening just to get the drinks and stuff like that, or taking money off of the welfare state or something like that. It's as if the value that they're extracting wasn't already coming from a kind of exploitative system, you know? And so it's very much about kind of articulating a kind of a chain of abusive relationships that are happening there. But yeah, I think the emphasis on I think it's just because Lukas had mentioned kind of speaking about alternative kind of practices, and I was thinking about what does that even mean, and there's kind of today there is no kind of alternative, you know. Alternative is to be off the grid completely, or to be kind of, I mean, there's all types of alternatives that are surrounding you. There's also no singular art world, and I think that that's also really important to affirm that there's a lot of different types of art worlds, and that there's always a kind of, like you're saying, like, you know, that there's an app for that. There's an art world for you there. There's an art world for you there, and I think that one of the tasks for a young artist as they're coming out of school, for instance, is to begin to identify those affiliations around the globe. And maybe you're not making like the most market worthy or institutionally friendly or coolest kind of work, but there is an art world for you, you know. There are like these kind of, there's lots of also like really crappy galleries that also can be very supportive for people, that I think that are crappy to me, but to everybody else I think is supportive. So I think the figure of the parasite is just a way to kind of also think about to also like own the fact that we are being kind of exploited and being kind of pulled from, and how can we also come into situations and also extract energy from different systems and predicaments.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
On that.